or two about media ethics. Professor David Flint was, after all, head of the Australian Press Council for 10 years in the 80s and 90s, before heading up the Australian Broadcasting Authority for the following 6 years. He joins me now from our CBD studio in Sydney. David Flint, thanks for your time. First to Britain, what do you make of these reports that Rupert Murdoch himself may be forced to resign? Is the scandal that big?
Well, I wouldn't have thought so. Whether there's going to be a change on the board of News Limited is a matter for them. They make up their own minds about this, but I think that would be an exaggerated reaction to what is happening in Britain, which is really a series of crimes or alleged crimes which have been discovered, and these are really matters best left to the criminal law. I think the politicians have overreacted. You get the sense of something like a hunter, a group of hunting dogs who are going after what is very much a tall poppy. And these are men and women, you might remember, who were very quiet about Rupert Murdoch beforehand, and all sorts of irrelevant matters are being brought in. For example, the takeover, which is not proceeding now, of Sky B.
Of course, Fleet Street has always been pretty notorious for, shall we say, sort of nefarious media practices, for sort of the paparazzi in Britain, for example, always looked upon as a bit more ferocious than in other parts of the world. Is this just a case, as you sort of suggested there, of people taking revenge out on not only Rupert Murdoch but the entire sort of press in Britain?
No doubt about that. Of course, I think it depends on where people stand as to which institutions will be the enemy. The press in Britain is really divided between a number of very important institutions, including the BBC, which is liberal left, News Limited, which tends to more the conservative side, and a few major publications which are also taking a position in this. And it's not unusual at all that the media might try to influence the political agenda. That happens all the time. It happens in all countries. The press, the media, doesn't always observe the great dictum of C.P. Scott that comment is free but facts are sacred.
In your time working very closely with Australian media ethics and complaints and the like, did you ever see anything like the sort of behaviour that we've seen uncovered in Britain here in Australia?
Not at all, and you've made a very important point there. The suggestion that there should be an inquiry into the Australian media because of something that is happening in Britain is completely out of place and irrelevant. We've never had anything like what happens in Britain, whether it's the readers of British newspapers or, as one suspects, the extreme competition that there is between the nationals in Fleet Street. Well, I think it really has resulted in very different practices, and as we've seen, they've gone over the line and gone away from breaches of ethics into breaches of the law. But that is best handled by the law, and certainly doesn't reflect on the media arrangements in Australia, which have been so often inquired into. It would be pointless to do yet another.
Well, the government seems to have been emboldened by what's happening overseas to really go after what it says is a bias in the Murdoch press, particularly the Daily Telegraph. Stephen Conroy, we've heard over the past few days, the Communications Minister really going after the Daily Telegraph, saying that it's been running a campaign to essentially try to overthrow the government. First of all, have you witnessed that sort of bias in papers like the Daily Telegraph and other Murdoch papers?
Well, I suppose you could say there's an emphasis on one side of the news, but what I've read in the Telegraph, what I've read in most of the newspapers, could not be said to be untrue. You could say, well, they've chosen a particular story and emphasised that. That's a different thing. They've made certain things newsworthy which other media haven't. But there was once not that long ago, an editorial in the Australian which said that had you been, this was at the time of the removal of Mr. Rudd from office, if you'd been reading the Fairfax newspapers and watching and listening to the ABC, you would have been surprised that that had happened, because a lot of that news, there were facts, if it wasn't going into those media, it certainly wasn't receiving the same emphasis that did receive in some of the news limited publications. But there's a wide diversity within the whole news table. For example, your channel, for example, could not be described as a right-wing channel. It's nothing like, for example, Fox News in the United States, which is screamingly right-wing. And I think it's very good to have a selection of outlets. If you go into the Daily Telegraph, for example, they have a daily photo op, which does stand out because it's on the editorial page. And they curiously seem to invariably or mainly interview people on the left. Well, that happens. You see the same with the letters to the editor. If you look at letters to the editor in the Australian, say a couple of years ago, they seem to be dominated by letters from Labour supporters. If you look at the Sydney Morning Herald, they seem to be today dominated by people from the Labour Party. Well, these things happen, but I think the whole thing is that there's a balance once you go across the whole spectrum. And of course now we also have not only the electronic media, and we have cable, but we also have the internet. So we've got an enormously wide selection of news. So there's no need for a government of all people to do an inquiry into the press.
Professor David Flint, we do thank you very much for your time. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thanks for your thoughts. I'm sure this is an issue that won't go away anytime soon.
Thank you.